At the museum here, we get a lot of people going up the top of the Indian Mound, and they come over here on Saturday morning because we're open from 9 to 12 on Saturday, and they ask questions, and we can't answer those questions very well. So we called in the experts tonight, the experts from the Miamisburg Historical Society, and these guys have been at it for years. So they will tell you about the great Miamisburg Mound. Gary Petticrew and Larry Suttman, the great Miamisburg Mound.
I'm amazed. Ooh, is that too loud? Can you hear me back there? My name is Gary Petticrew, and I'm the curator at the Miamisburg Historical Society, and I work with two really great guys. One of them you've probably met, John Warrington, in the back, and I hope all of you will take the time to look at the magnificent collection he has of Paleolithic, archaic, Adena, Hopewell, and for ancient Indian relics. He's been kind enough to bring them. They were his father's, but he can tell you about that. The other guy, along with another fellow who's no longer with us, Les Wade and Larry Suttman, we worked together for several years. Larry's goal was to create one of the larger libraries in our research center talking about the Adena Indians. And he got me interested in it. I've always had a love of ancient history. I am not a PhD, a master's degree archaeologist, but we do a lot of reading and research. So without further ado, what did she do with the thing? I'm going to start back before anybody was here, because I think you have to have an appreciation about this land. And we also have to realize that all of the people that we talk about live just like we do. They don't have the technology and the experience and the tools, but they live week by week, day by day, and today is the most important day. I want to start with, I don't know how many of you are familiar with plate tectonics, but I want to talk a little bit about this because it explains where this land and this earth was a long time ago. A man by the name of Alfred Weninger proposed this idea of continental drift. It wasn't exactly what we know today, and the maps on the next page will show you. It starts out with a continent called Pangaea, which was one great landmass. They broke apart over millions of years and formed the continents that there are today. It's still happening in many parts of the world, in Greenland and particularly in Africa. Ethiopia's Rift Valley is actually tearing Africa apart very slowly, but it is moving. And there's an international team of scientists who are measuring the positions and the change in the opening. Over about 250 million years, the continents have drifted apart, and global climate changes occurred continually. And I wish people today would separate global climate change from global warming. It's not the same thing. Global climate change happens over the millennia. It's going to happen, and there's not much we can do about it. Earthquakes, volcanoes, everything contributes to all of the continents moving. Anyway, this is an idea of 250 million years ago. Pangea was basically one mass, and the arrow shows where Ohio would be. And take a look, it's below the equator. So we've been tropical, we've been desert, we've been under the ocean, we've been under fresh water, and so forth. The Triassic period, oops, I'm not supposed to do that. The Triassic period occurred about 250 million years ago, and basically Asia and Africa and North America and Asia separated, and South America and Africa, the polar ice caps, and Australia. And during I'm showing you where Ohio, where we live, was during that period approximately. The Jurassic period was the period of the dinosaurs. They ruled the earth about 145 million years ago. We don't know what really did them in, except probably global climate change. Then we had the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago, and today. This is important because I want to show you what happened during that time. We've had at least 3 major glaciers come down from the North Pole, the poles. And the glacial maximum, the end of the last ice age, occurred about 30,000 years ago and covered North America as far south or near the Ohio River. It began its slow retreat between 10 and 12,000 years ago. Remember, 10,000 to 12,000. In some places, the last glacier was estimated to be a mile thick. So you can imagine as it moved south, it pulverized everything in its path. And also, which I didn't really think about too much, when the glacier was at its maximum size, it had absorbed the moisture from the earth, and the oceans were actually 400 feet plus shallower than they are today. And this is important because it might help explain some of the migrations of people throughout the globe. So any evidence of, say, 20-some thousand years ago, at least in North America and Northern Europe, was probably destroyed, just ground to bits. Plus, since the oceans were 400 and some feet shallower, when the glaciers diminished, the water went back in the oceans, and people tend to gravitate to the shorelines for living. So they're all covered by water probably by now. I don't know exactly how many miles out the shorelines were around the world, but they were far. This gives you a come on. This gives you a little idea the land masses at the height of the last glacier. This is the Bering Strait. This is the Gulf of Mexico. And look how close we are, Florida, from the Yucatan Peninsula, Cuba. England was all part of the European landmass, and that provided a stepping stone even from Europe to here. And then, of course, over here is Australia, and it was nearly connected at one point. So we can see about somewhere between 23,000 and 8,000 years ago, great migrations were possible of people, of plants, of animals. to give you a little idea of what cultures began emerging globally. About 10,000 BC, there's a place called Göbekli Tepe. It's a religious complex in the Anatolia region of Turkey. It's north of what we were all taught was the cradle of civilization, which was Samaria, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The interesting thing about it, it throws to the wind the idea from most anthropologists that hunter-gatherers did not build temples. Cities came first, then temples. As the hunter-gatherers settled, they built cities, then they built temples to worship in. You ought to go online and look at that site. It is absolutely amazing. And people didn't live in this complex. It's just a religious artifact. And a lot of the carvings, there were no metal tools to do work with. And most of the artwork that's on the walls and the columns would put a contemporary artist to shame the detail they have in their animal carvings. Not only flat, but in relief. Good place to go look. At about the same time in North America and Ohio, we have the first recognized Americans. They were Paleolithic hunters, and I use the word indistinct. They started disappearing or melding into the next group around 8,000 BC. They were nomads. They hunted the mastodon and what other large animals were available to them. They didn't settle, and they moved about continually. They didn't build homes. They usually were in rock shelters and so forth. From about 8,000 BC to 1500 BC, the next recognized American groups are called the archaic hunter-gatherers. And they melded or became indistinct about 1500 BC. It's interesting, around 2000 BC, the Great Pyramid at Giza, Pharaoh Khufu built the large pyramid about this same time. The next group were the late archaic Americans, and there's not a lot known about these people. They're called the glacial came culture, and they spread from Canada all the way down into Ohio. They were hunters and gatherers. They ate seeds and things like that, but the unique thing was they began to bury their dead. But they buried them in the easiest place. When the glaciers receded, they left gravel pits and sand pits. I guess that's what a cave refers to. But they buried their dead at the edges of the glaciers in the gravel pits as they began. And they were around from 2500 BC to about 800. Then they melded into the next group. Oh, by the way, Rome was founded about within that same time period. Okay, about 2000 BC to 900 AD, the Mesoamerican group, the Maya civilization, had its classic period between 250 AD and 900 AD. Also, King Solomon's palace was built on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem about 800 BC. Well, we go over to the Ohio side, and in 1800 BC to about 300 AD, Adena Americans became farmers. They gardened, they were artisans, they were traders, and they were the first of the mound builders in this area. The year Christ was born, 0 AD, we track another group called the Hopewell Americans. And they had a very short time, only about 200 years. I have a theory that the Hopewell and it's okay to call them their own cultural group, were the zenith in terms of artwork and trade and commerce, the zenith of the Adena culture, because there are so many similarities. A lot of the effigy mounds, the death-like serpent mound, are attributed to the Hopewell. But the Adenas built effigy mounds too. Go to Newark. There's a whole series of mounds that are in geometric shape. Carbon dating says that they had to be within the Adena time frame. So what we got to see here is over time, these groups just didn't disappear and somebody else came along. They melded into each other, probably, because they began to meet people from other cultures. From 700 AD to about 1200 AD, a transitional period occurred, and for some reason, the cultures declined, the culture of the Hopewells and the Adenas. I haven't seen a good archaeological explanation for them disappearing, but at least the culture declined. About 1200 AD to 1600 AD, the Fort Ancient group began to come into meaning and bearing. It wasn't until 1600 AD that the present modern Indian tribes that we refer to actually began to enter here. One theorist says that the the Iroquois Indian tribes from New York were running out of food supplies, so they came to this area and may have driven out or eliminated the peoples of the Fort Ancient group. They were called the Beaver Wars, and they came to get the beaver pellets that were being harvested here. But then we end up with the real Native American Indians, Seneca, Shawnee, Cherokee, Miami, and others. Primary habitats of the three major cultures. Is this going in and out, or is it just my hearing? Okay. The Adena culture landmass is shown in green. The Hopewell culture shrunk. And then the Fort Ancient culture expanded again. They were right before the native Indian tribes that we are aware of. In fact, Sunwatch is attributed to the Fort Ancient people. What do we know about the Adena? Well, we know the most about their burial practices and artifacts. They occupied this area for at least 2,000 years. But they brought with them an advanced culture. Several archaeologists and anthropologists say they did not evolve here. They came here from someplace else because of the high social activity that they exercise. We'll get into that a little later. Well, although origins are unknown and a lot is speculated, but if you look at their art, it's similar to Mayan culture, and some, but not all, have elated skulls. Some of the people in the burial mounds, which was typical of the South America, Mesoamerica cultures. And that's also characteristic of the Mayans. But they also mirrored a larger group called the Mississippi group. And the Mississippi group primarily is centered around in Illinois. What's the name of the city?
St. Louis.
St. Louis. Cochica? Cahokia, Illinois, which was a large concentration. They built mounds, but they also built platform mounds, which is also indicative of the Mesoamerican Mayans. So they did, however, in their burial practice, the Adinas shared with them. Who knows? Did they mingle? You know, they probably didn't develop separately. Also, the Mississippian culture goes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And remember how close I showed you the Yucatan was to Florida and the Gulf. The Gulf was much smaller. And I'm not saying that the Aleutian Islands and the Bering Strait, people didn't also come from Asia. I'm not saying that. I'm having trouble with this. What'd you do? Get down. This isn't working anymore? Wonderful. Okay, wait a minute. You got to get further down.
Back up?
No, down. Okay, one more.
Okay.
One more. I'm sorry, folks. Technical difficulties. And so far, we have not discovered, or anthropologists, archaeologists, and geologists have not discovered anything indicating that the Adena had a written language. They didn't write anything down that we know of. Let me try it. There, I'm good. And so far, no one has discovered that they were a warlike people. We haven't found mass graves. We haven't found skeletons with arrowheads in them to any significant degree. So we don't believe they or the Hopewell were warlike. Yes?
Well, I've been on top of the mound across the street, and there's a tunnel, a hole that goes down to the bottom.
Yes.
Aware of that?
We'll get to it.
You said something about the dinosaurs dying. I thought in geological, a meteor landed somewhere. And
yes.
They found a big hole in the Gulf of Mexico near the Mexican border. That apparently was where the meteorite landed.
During the Jurassic period.
Yeah.
What he's saying is a large meteorite may be attributed to the demise of the dinosaurs. Okay. They traded a lot. They traded as far north as Canada and as far south as the Gulf Stream, east and west. But they traveled by foot or in river or creek boats. They did not have horseback. So the Adenas and the Hopewells never used horses for transportation. And they went to find copper as far away as Lake Superior and shell. They made shell ornaments that came from the Gulf of Mexico. So they had a wide trading area. And I'm sure other traders came through this area as well. It's not working. There we go. We're way ahead of ourselves. Well, how did that happen? This is the latter part of Larry's talk. I'm only going to get into minutes. Can you go back by hand faster? Keep going. Keep going. Way back. I'm ruining all my shocks. Keep going.
We won't pretend to be shocked.
Ah, here we go. You talked about farming, or we talked about hunting. They also were the first to begin to domesticate plants for food. Most of them began as wild, and they domesticated them and started planting gardens. Some of the things were squash, sunflower, sumpweed, gooseroot, knotweed, and maygrass. These plants are referred to as the Eastern Agricultural Complex, and the Ohio and Mississippi valleys are only one of 7 regions in the world that developed local plants into the basis for a food-producing economy. And this really changed the hunter-gatherer life. They no longer had to be solely dependent on just hunting animals and gathering berries and so forth. Those plants are divided into oily and starchy. This isn't working right.
Ad lib.
Well, I had pictures of the plants. It's not going to do it. Anyway, those plants were categorized as oily and starchy, which added to the diet, and some of them produced grain. I think it was some kind of barley that they could grind for meal and flour. Here are some unusual, I say, Adena artifacts. You see the elongated skull. They worked copper. That was from the Great Lakes area. And over there is a tablet. They had found several tablets in mounds. These were, they believe, were used to put prints on vases that they made, pottery, maybe even to like tattoo yourself, because they had found some with color embedded in them. Or they decorated their clothes, their skins. There is a tool. It's a chipping tool. It's not an arrowhead, and that helped them skin animals, clean the surface of the animal skins and so forth. That is a mass of Adena tools that have been accumulated. And this one, those are amulets that they might have worn, they believe. And if you could see closely, they are decorated. The other image is a pipe. They were great at making pipes, and when they buried the dead in the mound, they usually broke the pipe. So many of the pipes that have been found in burial mounds are broken. And normally, that's the reason why that's unusual. They usually didn't do human effigies. They usually were animals, birds, reptiles, and so forth. The last ones I wanted to show you are these 3. This one was dug up by an archaeological dig in Chillicothe, Ohio, on the Adena farm. And that's where the name Adena came from. There was a mound there that got later termed the Adena. And it was scientifically and archaeologically dug. Everything was measured. In fact, it destroyed the mound. It's no longer there. But they unearthed this. That's now the Ohio State artifact. In fact, I think somebody told me it's on tour in France right now, but it belongs to the Ohio Historical Society. But what I wanted to point out when we talked about migrations, similar features. This is a Mayan face, and here is another face. That looks like a shaman who had a bear skin in some sort of ritual position. Anyway, the important thing is to show connections with other cultures. Okay, this is an artist rendering of an Adena ceremonial area, and you'll see it surrounded by a mound. They did not live inside of those. Those were ceremonial. And certain times of the year, people would come from near and far, and they would do whatever they did for their rituals and meetings and so forth. Their homes were outside. But the interesting thing is, hope this knocks your socks off, Miamisburg. When Zachariah Hole came here in 1796, it is recorded as particularly by Beer's history, there was a mound that encircled what is now downtown Miamisburg. It started a little north of the Bell Bridge, ran along the current levee to the outskirts of the town, and this etching is from 1884, came back around past St. Jacob's Church and the canal and connected. It was about 6 foot high, 50 feet wide, and it was made of yellow clay. Now, if it's typical of what we saw on the other slide, people didn't live here. This was a ceremonial site, probably. That's the theory. Something that big would have had to support a pretty big population of Adenas or Hopewells or whoever. And this place, this area that we live in, is just riddled with artifacts and mounds from these people. In 1900, the state of Ohio did a survey of the mounds, and there were over 10,000 significant mounds in Ohio. You know what it is today? 900. They've all been destroyed either by urban growth or highways, all of the modern technology. Plus, people dug their stuff out. A lot of people had this stuff in their private collections, a lot of the artifacts. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. Not a lot of people know that. It disappeared, we believe, as the town grew. People needed bricks, and they took the clay and made the bricks for their buildings. It's also interesting, we know that the Miami Indians, or Shawnees, lived across the river on the other side, and as they integrated into society here, they did bricklaying. In fact, the Gephardt Smokehouse at the Gephardt Tavern some of the bricks were made by the Indian population that was still here. Okay, this is an idea of what they think an Adena house would have been built, looked like. They were circular. They were on an average diameter of 25 to 45 feet. They normally supported one family. And they were made of poles that connected vertically, or connected to vertical poles in the center where you see the fire pit. The sides were sticks or logs, larger logs, and they were covered with skins or some kind of fibrous material that they would have weaved through there to protect them from the cold. And that's what a typical Adena village might have looked like. And you can see he's hoeing his garden, his sunflowers. there were several prominent people who played a part in preserving this mound over here. First of all, Dr. Treon bought the property that contained the mound somewhere around 1820. He thought that it should have been preserved. It was used as a farming place, and he didn't want to see it destroyed. He didn't know much about it, but he didn't want it destroyed. In fact, when Zachariah first came here, they asked the Indian tribes that were here, peoples, what that was. They had no idea. They called it the knob. They had no idea people were buried in it. So that history was lost to the Indian tribes. Anyway, Edwin Davis and Ephraim Squire came through here to do a survey of the Mississippi and Ohio Indian mounds. And in 1851, they published their findings in the Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. It is the first official publication of the Smithsonian Institute. And guess whose mound is the first picture? The Great Mound. Yes. It's neat. It gives you cold chills. Oh. Treon, along about 1920, that stayed in the family for over 100 years, the mound did. And then Treon sold it to Charles Boss Kettering, the guy that developed the starter in Dayton. He built the park. And later then, I forget the exact date, but then he turned the whole park, it was about 37 acres, over to the Ohio Historical Society. This is the earliest painting we have of the Great Mound. And it was done circa 1835. It's the oldest artist rendering we have. And then this Great Mound was the template, I believe, that is used in that Smithsonian book that we're talking about. If you notice, it's also been rumored, when you look at these pictures, that some farmer might have planted apple trees on the mound. Okay. There were two major destructions to this mound. Not destructions, but invasions. The first one was the non-scientific digging down through the top. As far as we know, they recovered nothing. They saw some things. They said they saw a skeleton, but nothing has been produced that came from the inside of that mound. So that was rather a foolish effort. This, we believe, was done in the late 1800s, and the photo taken in the 1900s, some sweet farmer decided to make a cow barn in the side of the mound. I don't know who he was. Somebody said the picture that we have says that little girl is a Taylor, was her last name. I don't know whether they lived there on that farm or what, but that disappeared quickly. I don't think it did too much damage to the mound. It's down at the foot, and this is looking from the south side, just about where the kids' playground is. And this is what it looks like today. Now it's interesting, in all the years that this has been here, if you go to the Grave Creek Mound, incidentally, the Grave Creek Mound is king of the hill in the country. It's 69 feet high. Ours is 68. We're the largest in Ohio, but I think we could probably compete for the largest conical earthen mound in the country. And I'm going to turn it over to Larry unless you have any questions. Yes?
Or me.
Go.
The elongated skulls, was
Yeah.
that just the way they were born, or was
No.
that, I've heard they bound...
They bound the heads to a flat surface,
Yeah.
and they grew that way. Probably they had to grow that way until they were 3-4 years old, I would imagine. I don't know that,
Those
but
were hard.
What
Yeah.
was it? What was the question?
the elongated heads, how were those made? And the supposition is, I never really studied it, but I think they mounted them on a board-like structure and kept their heads strapped down for a year, 2, 3 years until the bones formed. That was a religious ritual. Now, not everybody in the mounds had that kind of skull. It just is interspersed. So maybe those were the weirdo religious people. I don't know. Next question.
Had you ever heard anything about the composition of that soil in the mountain? I heard this years ago. I don't know if it's just a farce or what. It's not the same as everything around here. In fact, they said the only thing similar to that was over in Indiana, man.
Well, knowing the culture at the time, and they didn't use pack animals, that had to be carried in skin baskets, dug up and placed. Now, I don't know what Larry might get into this. This didn't happen overnight. It took generations. That mound was built over several hundred years. Most of the mounds, the big ones, were. So I don't recall an account that talked about the soils. They found, there's newspaper accounts about the dig that went down, and they're not that reliable, but they found different color soils. What did that mean? Was that rotted wood? Was it human remains that had colored the earth? The unfortunate thing is it was done by non-professionals, and they didn't really document anything, nor are any artifacts from it that we are aware of that still exist. Now, in one way, that's a blessing. This mound is probably the only pristine mound in its basic original configuration. The Great Creek Mound has been archaeological excavated, and it lost some of its pristineness. Other mounds have done the same thing. My only comment before I give it to Larry, and I talk way too much, I've never understood all of the mounds, the significant ones, the Great Creek, the Newark, they're all on the National Register of Historic Places. Why isn't this one? You need to ask our city officials. Go ahead.
My only question is, for tens of thousands of years, all these societies, or what you're going to call it, developed and migrated one to another and went from one to another. What was the temperature like that caused these? Was the temperature in this area relatively the same? Or
I would say between 10 and 12,000 years ago, when the glacier started to recede, it was pretty cold. Temperatures moderated as the glaciers receded. Probably by the time the Adinas were in full performance and the Hopewells, it was pretty much like it is now. Close to it. You know, we have blizzards some years and we don't have one for 10. Yes?
Does this mean that it's not like the Earth as it aged got warmer, or did it get warmer as
it did everything. It got hot, it got cold. It's been through so many cycles. That's why it blows my mind when you talk about global climate change. That is real. However, it takes such a long time, we don't notice it. And that's what really changes climate. The Sahara Desert, for one thing, was once a tropical place with trees and lakes and streams. But the way the continents have shifted put that into a drier, hotter zone. A million years from now, it might revert back or end up where Europe is, which is a more temperate climate. I'm spending too long. I got to give this to Larry. Yes?
Well, I said before the meteorite landed at the Gulf of Mexico. That's wrong. A meteorite you can hold in your hand. This is something big, maybe a mile or two in diameter, like a small moon.
Yes, I didn't catch that when you said that.
It's like when we had a meteor crater out in Arizona. It's big.
One other thing before I leave. When we say Adena and Hopewell and Fort Ancients. These are not the names of tribes. It describes a culture defined by their tools, how they lived, and what they did. They're not Indian tribes. They're cultures, civilizations. Okay.
My name's Larry Suttman, and thanks everybody for coming tonight. I'm glad we have such a nice crowd. Gary and I wanted to make this part of the program a little different, personal, and I hope provocative. We felt that there are important aspects of the Indian mound that need to be talked about. People should be aware of what is happening, or maybe not happening. We are dealing with facts. You may not like everything you hear tonight, as you found with Gary, but I hope you'll find it interesting. I'm going to attempt to summarize some of the 10 questions we most likely get when they rear their angry head. We're going to talk about rumors and mysteries, and perhaps, just perhaps, we can surprise you some ways tonight. I have to read mine because I don't have Gary's ability to memorize all this, and if I talk without a script, I get off on a tangent, and you never believe. Incidentally, the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society in Columbus morphed into the Ohio Historical Society, and then just a few years ago, they changed it to the Ohio History Center. Rather than Ohio History Center every time, I'm going to call it the OHC. Let's see. Is there treasure buried in our Indian mound? People are asking this all the time. It's very possible that the 1869 dig was a treasure hunt, because they certainly weren't scientists looking. As Gary mentioned, the Great Creek Mound has been decimated by people digging for treasure. They did find quite a lot of artifacts which they could sell, and that kept them going. The Great Creek Mound was not a public mound until the 1900s, so they had a tough time. They didn't find any silver or gold, but they found knives, axe heads, pipes, that type of thing that they could sell. And that's what they did. That's why they were digging. The usual treasure found is freshwater pearls, mica, copper beads, clay, carvings, pipes, and pottery. And sometimes even human bones were found in the graves. It has to be kept in mind that when a scientific exploration is done, they reduce the mound right down to the ground level. They take it out spadeful by spadeful, they sieve it to see what they can find. When they're done, there's just a flat area. The mound is gone. If they did find anything on our mound, they didn't say anything about it. Was our mound built by a race of giants? I think this story is popular because people like to think of 8-foot giants building our mound. I think it's kind of funny because back in the 1800s, there were several news articles. One was that a tree near the mound blew over, and underneath the roots they found an 8-foot skeleton. Unfortunately, the skeleton was never preserved, and there were no credible witnesses. Same thing happened with a road crew that said they found a skeleton that was 8 foot. That's about the same time. And again, they didn't save anything. There were no credible witnesses. The Miamisburg Library started the third rumor. They gave us a collection of prehistoric stones. These were axe heads, pounders, scrapers, pestles, like this. One of the axe heads is a big, giant, heavy thing. I don't know how much it weighs, probably 8 pounds. And everybody said, to swing an axe like that, you had to be a giant. And so that was history. And they never stopped to think that in your neighbor's garage, he probably has a 8-pound sledgehammer, but he's not a giant, or maybe he is. There's no doubt that the mound was built by the Adena culture. The studies have shown that the average male was 5 foot 5 inches tall, the female was 5 foot 2 inches tall, which sort of puts to rest the giant theory. There was a lot of confusion as to why our mound was built. We hear stories all the time. It was a signal mound. And I looked at them and I said, what do you mean signal mound? So let's try something here to debunk this. Let's pretend that all the big Indian chiefs and medicine men get together for a big powwow. They all talk and laugh and smoke their pipes. Then finally the big man gets up and he says, I think we ought to build a huge signal mound so we can signal important messages to other Indian tribes. And another chief gets up and he says, well, how high do you think we should build this? And he said, well, 68 feet. And finally, one of the wives in the fourth row puts up her hand. She says in her little small voice, she says, how long will it take to build this? And they think for a while, and then he smiles and announces, it'll take us 300 years to build it. The fact remains there is no evidence that our mound was intentionally built as a signal mound. It's a burial mound. They haven't found a lot of burials because they haven't reduced the mound to ground level. A lot of people ask us, why have there been so many changes out there? For example, there used to be 2 fireplaces in the large shelter at each end, and those have been taken out. A lot of the trees have been taken out. I don't know how many of you remember, in the smaller shelter, they had a pump that you could, if you pumped it hard enough, you'd get some cold spring water that really tasted wonderful. But it's gone. The tin cup that was on a string is gone also. They said the water is not safe to drink, but they had to use municipal water. And my theory is that all our pioneers from yesteryear died because they were drinking raw, unfiltered water. You probably have noticed that the Miamisburg Mound is a lot smaller than when you were young. And that's a fact, because the golf course needed more land, and of course they got it. I don't know how many of you remember the bronze plaque that stood on 2 concrete legs down at the corner, down at the base of Mound Avenue, Dixie Highway. It had an engine on the top, and he has arms up to the heaven like that. And I remember it said, 1 mile east, Miamisburg Mound, a burial tumulus of the mound builders. Of course, that's gone too. If you access the OHC website, they say the mound was covered with stone. I don't necessarily believe that. They say actually at one time the Miamisburg Mound was covered in stone. Now at Fort Ancient, they do have a small single grave that they recreated, and they covered it with stone. But that was the Fort Ancient culture, the Hopewell culture. And that does not mean that Adena did that. In fact, of all the Adena mounds, thousands of them, they never found one that was covered with stone. The astounding proof they offer is that when they did the 1869 dig, they said, I quote, at a depth of 24 feet, the workmen came upon a triangular stone planted perpendicularly in the earth with the point upward. Around it, at an angle of about 45 degrees and overlapping each other like shingles on a roof, were placed stones averaging about 1 foot in diameter, all rough but nearly uniform in size, similar to those quarried in the hills about the city. And then he goes on, could this have been an altar? Might not these people here have offered human and other sacrifice in the event of pestilence, famine, or the memory of their illustrious dead beneath? Appearances now conspire to render such conjecture plausible, and underneath the stones the indications seem to strengthen this supposition. The color of the soil, heretofore of light yellow, changes to dark umber. Similar appearance to the consistency of blue mass. We find no bones or other evidence of decayed bodies to account for this. What then could have caused such a marked and sudden change in the color? Beneath the stones or the floor of the altar, it must have been blood, the drippings of burnt flesh and offal from the bodies sacrificed, trickling down between the stones and seeping into the earth. In time would produce such a result, and in the absence of testimony, we accept the argument as conclusive. Now, this is the guy that's writing the history as they dig. The fact that they did not count the number of stones, he didn't say how many stones there were. There could have been 3 or 30 or 300. But he mentions that they were the stones as make up the floor of the altar, which indicates a flat plane. You would think that they were covering the mound, it would be in a dome shape. Another question we always get is exactly how high is our mound? Let's see if this works for me.
You say 6 feet.
You might be surprised, I don't know how many of you found this, but out at the mound there are 2 tablets. There's one on a granite boulder on the south side that says this Indian mound is 70 feet high. And then OEC put a tablet up at the foot of the steps on a pedestal, and it says this mound is 65 feet high. Can't you imagine a teacher trying to explain this when she has her field trip class with her? In 2011, Burt Logan, who was CEO and executive director of OEC, was here. He had just come into office. And he came down and looked at the mound. We went out there. One of the things we asked him is, how do you measure how high a mound is? And he said, quote, "You determine the official height of an Indian mound. It's determined by the first documented figure as measured by an engineer or surveyor." For example, the Grave Creek Mound was measured in 1839 as 69 feet high. And even though it's a lot lower now, it still stands as 69 foot high, officially. In 1845, the newly formed Smithsonian in Washington sent 2 rugged individuals on a trip to measure the significant mounds of the Ohio Valley. Ephraim Squire, a historical writer, and I should be doing this. It's not doing it. You have to listen to me. And Edwin Davis, a surveyor, accomplished this demanding feat. It took them 2 years to do this. And they cataloged the prominent mounds in Ohio, the Ohio Valley, and Mississippi Valley, including Miami Valley. They measured the Indian mound as 68 feet, not 65, not 70. In their book, they refer to it, as Gary said, the Grand Mound. And there were 306 woodcuts. They don't have photographs. Of the 306 woodcuts, our mound was woodcut number 1 on page 5. The Smithsonian Institution is now referred to as the National Museum of the United States. It has 19 museums and 9 research facilities. It's the largest museum in the world. And its opinion is very rarely challenged. They published their new book. They wanted a new series of books to set a scholarly and scientific precedent for the Institute. Incidentally, we have this book, a copy of this book down at the Market Square building if anyone wants to come down and look at it. But at least you know that according to the Smithsonian, it's 68 feet, no matter what you read or what you hear on the website, whatever, it's 68 feet. Why aren't there trees and grass on the mound? This is a question we get all the time. For a long time there was. They had trees. The trees provided so much shade that there was not a huge growth of weeds. Prior to the 2008 recession, the city of Miamisburg leased the flat area of the land in the park for a nominal fee, and they mowed the grass and took care of it. As far as the mound, the people in Columbus sent down a crew from Columbus. They mowed the grass on the mound. Once the trees were removed, and they also put a fence around the base of it, they couldn't mow anymore, because with their mowers they couldn't turn around when they had a fence at the bottom. So they stopped mowing. And because the trees were gone, the weeds came up. And it's sort of been that way ever since. They tried other methods, which I won't talk about. They were unique. They weren't successful. You've probably seen other mounds, such as the famous Cahokia mounds. There's 80 of them, just east of St. Louis on I-75. I-70 goes right straight through the middle of them. They're well worth seeing. Ohio's Great Shipwreck mounds, southeast of Hillsborough. These are good examples of beautiful grassy mounds, and they're so easy to look at. In 2009, the city initiated a project to restore the aesthetic beauty of the Miamisburg Mound. And we all know how that turned out. This was the start of what the Columbus people called the caretaker agreement. Let's see. The caretaker agreement was, it came to pass because at the recession, the Ohio Historic Center got about 90% of its money from the state. And they were the first ones to get their budget cut. So all work stopped. They have over 100 sites, mounds, state parks, state memorials, and plus a big museum in Columbus. And now they didn't have any money, so they just, they panicked, really. But fortunately, they had a plan that had been formulated in 1938 called the Caretaker Plan. And so they initiated this plan. And over 100 different sites were given to cities, groups, historic societies to take care of. For example, Fort Ancient was given to the Boonshock Museum, and they take care of the maintenance of it, they take care of managing it, and pretty much paying for it. But the Columbus group still owns the site. That's the way it was with Miamisburg. It was apparent from the start in Miamisburg that they could not find anyone to manage the site, which was unfortunate. The girl at Five Rivers Metro Park offered that they use the Ohio Transportation seed mix, which is fast growing, won't grow over 12 inches high. It just strangles out all other weeds. Unfortunately, the Parks and Recreation made no attempt to follow up on that. Every spring, the fire department does a burn. In my mind, this only serves to germinate seeds and stimulate new weed growth. If we could simply cancel the caretaker agreement, it would solve a lot of problems. Miamisburg is, unfortunately, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Has anyone ever been injured on the mound? This comes up all the time. If a large group wants to reserve the mound for a meeting or whatever, they'll probably find that they have to buy a $1 million insurance policy. And there have been more than one group looks elsewhere because of that. Why do they do this? they have a perceived image of someone suing them for $10 trillion. And they feel they have an exposure to a liability suit. So they have made that their number one priority. There's no number 2 or 3 or 4. And they have done everything they've done, done because they feel it's dangerous. For example, the girl from Parks and Recreation has said publicly there would be innumerable broken arms and broken legs, and we can never allow that. And this is typical of Miamisburg's view. We looked back in newspapers back to 1870, never found one single injury, broken bone or concussion or anything like that. There were skin nose and skin knees, but nothing serious. There was, our records only go up to 1975, so I asked some of the old timers, Randy Staley was one, and he told me there was one case, a man was on the mound, not on the steps, he was on the mound, he was finished, he was apparently cutting weeds, and he started going down to the bottom of the mound, and he didn't realize that because of the steep angle, the momentum speeds you up. First thing you know, you're running. And he came bounding down the mound and stepped into a groundhog hole and broke his leg. And they had to get the fire department to rescue him. Incidentally, I asked the Department of Parks and Recreation if they were going to get rid of the groundhogs, and they said, "What groundhogs?" Who owns the mound, really? It started with rustic log railings back in 1934 when the Civilian Conservation Corps built most of the refinements on the mound. By 70 years later, 2007, they were in need of replacement. The OHC embarked on a plan to replace the railings around and on the mound. And there was a man named Neil Hitch, I don't know if any of you remember him. He came down and was in charge of that. They had taken off the horizontal railings and gotten rid of them when the recession bounced down on them, and all work, of course, was suspended. Let's see. The Ohio Historic Center owns the mound. Even though we have a caretaker agreement, it depends on who you believe. The people up at Columbus say, yes, there is a caretaker agreement, it's Miamisburg, and so forth and so on. But the people in Miamisburg, Parks and Recreation and Administration, say there is no such agreement. But the fact that they are doing things to the mound indicates that they have jurisdiction. Why is our mound so ugly? Years ago, our mound was considered one of the most beautiful mounds in the country, a perfect cone. It was a thing of beauty. At the top, there were log railings just a bit over 3 foot high. There were seats for those who had to sit to catch their breath after that climb. Even sitting, you could see easily over the log railings, and the view was spectacular, unless a tree was in the way. The fact is that people doing things to the mound made it ugly. Chain link fence, the cheap looking 2x4 banister, and the high prison bars on top. Who's responsible? When you get right down to it, the city of Miamisburg decided and planned that, and they're the ones that installed it. The Ohio Historic Center in Columbus had nothing to do with it. Gary and I were frustrated because the mound looked bad year after year after year. Nothing was being done. So we decided to do something about it. We went to Columbus, talked to George Kane, who is the director of mounds that division, and some of his associates. And we proposed a plan that we could restore the mound without any exposure to money by the City of Miamisburg or the Miamisburg Historical Association. And I had talked to the mayor before I went up there, talked to the mayor after he came back. I told him that they were excited about the idea and they wanted to talk further about getting it on board. And he mentioned he thought it was a great idea and he thought Miamisburg might be able to chip in and help with the money. The meeting was on September 5th, 2013, the mayor's office. Well, they came early from Columbus and they toured the mound. And ironically, this is the first they'd seen the mound since Miamisburg had made their improvements. And they were appalled. They were horrified. And the meeting never really got off the ground. George Kane, the director from Columbus, said, the mounds must go. And the Miamisburg officials said, the mounds are going to stay just the way they are as long as we're in charge. And the people from Columbus packed their papers and stomped out of there. That was the last of that meeting. And incidentally, the highest mountain in Germany is in the Bavarian Alps. It's spelled Zugspitze, and in German that's Zugspitze, which is hard to remember. At one point, we walked down a long, cool tunnel to an outlook, and this outlook was basically just a slab that stuck out in space, sort of like a Grand Canyon. And the view was magnificent. The height was 7,000 feet. It was almost straight down. And believe it or not, they had a railing that was 40 inches high. And, you know, it's hard to say what's 7,000 feet. The Empire State Building is 103 stories. So what you have to do is imagine a 585-story building. That would be 5 Empire State Buildings, one on top of the other. That's over a mile. And they have a railing 40 inches high. Wow, I mean, that makes our little jailhouse bars and fences look really silly. In other directions, we have, among the things we've accomplished is we've accumulated a lot of material. And we've filled up quite a few books, 3-ring binders, photo books. We have a lot of books on mounds in general. We looked at our website. We were appalled with our website because it was all goofy. So we changed it. Same with the brochures, which were like, I don't know, 20 years old. And there were a lot of errors in them. We gave talks at schools. We studied Mr. Blossom's account of the '69 exploration quite closely. We looked at some websites for the Ohio History Center and decided that they weren't worth watching because they had so many errors in them. I'm going to skip over. Gary told me before he came here, he says, Larry, he says, try to keep it positive. Can you hold your questions till after I'm done, because otherwise I'll lose my place. And you don't want to see that. Yeah. A lot of people want to know about the vault in the mound. If you go on a website or read a book, they talk about the vault. Frankly, there is no vault. A vault is a room or a chamber that the people are buried in. And quite often there's artifacts buried with them. As proof of their vault, the Ohio History Center bases it entirely on the narrative of the dig by Ezra Blossom, which essentially says that at 37 feet approved, they found a spot on the side of the shaft, which apparently was the end of a log, and they pushed in approved 10 feet, which went easily by hand. And for a time, this circumstance created considerable excitement among the workers and members in the committee, the opinion prevailing that a vault had been discovered. They didn't stop to investigate it. They let it go until they were done. When they were done, August 13th, this is very short. After tunneling in a short distance to the northwest side of the shaft at 37 feet and following the course of the decayed log mentioned heretofore, that's it. And then they go on, they say, and at 24 feet, a platform was erected, blah, blah, blah. In other words, if they had read the whole article, they would never have said there was a vault there. You got to remember that this group that did the 1869 dig was consisted of 3 bankers, 3 merchants, a physician, a miller, a dry goods clerk, bridge builder, tailor, cigar maker, farmer, attorney, and newspaper editor. We should consider Mr. Blossom. He was probably a character. I wish I'd known him. Mr. Blossom felt that he knew what people wanted in newspapers. They would buy newspapers because there was something exciting and wicked or comical or terrible. That's what they enjoyed reading about. And he fed this need with flowery, fancy words. The mastery of the English language was astounding. If the story was dull, they gave it real punch to make it exciting. The readers hung on every word. Let's go to an example. July 15th, 1881, a cow got loose and wandered into a neighbor's garden. That's what happened. Let's see how they reported it. A rampageous cow invaded Bodkin's garden lately and browsed upon herbaceous products, consuming cabbages, radishes, beets, lettuce. Bodkin's 4-year-old daughter surveyed the scene of devastation and, possessing vivid recollections of miscellaneous diet, remarked, "Pa, don't you think she went home and puked?" But that's an example where they created all this because they wanted to sell newspapers. And it was interesting. People loved it. My point is that while they were indeed gifted writers, they did a poor job of scientific exploration. The point is, they tunneled in trying to find the vault, and they could not find anything. You know, one thing I always remember when I was a teenager is my father always watched Milton Berle. I did not like it, but since we were watching it, I watched it too. But one thing I remember, Milton would always say, always leave them laughing. And I guess that stuck with me. And tonight, I can't make you laugh, but I'd like to give you a smile when you leave here. So, down at the Market Square building, we have lots of old newspapers. The oldest is a Gridiron, which dates 1839, and had a skeleton frying in a frying pan on its masthead. It was mainly political, like most early ones were, but it did have Mayor's Court and Town Marshal, and that's where I found this gem. Lawyers back then were not silver-tongued like they are now, but it's not because they didn't do their best. This is relative to an assault and battery case before the county court concerning 2 men from Miamisburg. They had disappeared in the Gridiron in the year 1839. Cause: the scoundrel, poltroon, and coward did deliver a knock in the blubber chops, whereon on or about the 30th day of March 1839, one RLP, in violation of the state of Ohio, did, not having the fear of the Lord before his eyes, but being instigated by the devil, did stab, shoot, wound, kick, strike, knock down, draw blood, bite, black eye, tear hat, rip coat, pull buttons on pants, disarrange vest, and tramp on the toes of 1 RCS of said county with intent, wait for it, to rob, murder, flitch, and otherwise deprive the said RCS of his standing with the aid of the following weapons, to wit, pistols, muskets, cannon, blunderbuss, swords, cutlasses, bayonets, bowie knives, chisels, gimlets, augers, tap bowlers, stones, brickbats, gravel, sand, snuff, tobacco juice, cordwood, sticks, canes, bludgeons, broom handles, and straw, with an intent to disagree.
Yeah.